this is a climate change problem, or it's exacerbated by climate change. It is going to get worse. We have some control over how much worse it's going to get. And that conversation, and even just the idea of climate change, so often gets left out of reporting when you're in a moment. There's like a huge house, like some celebrity's house is on fire, and that's like far more compelling than emissions. But if we're going to have a saner future, that needs to be part of the conversation.
All right, we are back with Liz Weil, features writer at New York Magazine. She previously covered climate in California for ProPublica and was a writer-at-large for the New York Times Magazine. She won an Emmy in 2023 for work on a documentary, Unlivable Oasis, about a Southern California community of farm workers living in sun-baked trailers. Boy, it's been a tough couple days, huh? I don't know. I was reading your old article and I was like, I really want to get this person on the podcast. We've never met before, so I appreciate you doing it. Well, one of those articles you wrote that jumped off at me, I just want to start there because it was kind of like a throwaway line in one of the articles you wrote. Where we are now, January, the fresh and less fire alarming time of the year, should be the moment for us to relax. You wrote about that in a January article, I think in 2022, and here we are. That's a pretty ominous sign. So I'm wondering what your biggest picture thoughts are watching everything going on in LA.
My biggest picture thoughts are, it's heartbreaking, and it's like all of the issues all at once happening in LA right now. And I wrote about this a bunch. Like, if you're a person who follows climate and follows wildfire in particular, or if you're a fire scientist, you know all this is going to happen. And it's just all the more horrifying to just like see the same movie again and worse, given that, you know, it's hotter and drier. It's barely rained in LA in 7 months. And there's not a lot you can do once there's a windstorm and a fire burning.
Yeah. I want to get your articles, like your first article, the one that prompted me to reach out was titled "Megafires: Why Won't Anyone Listen?" So it was written and it was written in 2020, but it references an interview with a guy going back to 2005. A lot of that is about like much of the more, what I guess, urban rural part of California where kind of the forests meet the communities, if you will. And so I do, the LA situation is a little bit distinct in one sense. I pulled up, there's this ditty in Slouching to Bethlehem. She writes, "It's hard for people who have not lived in LA to realize how radically the Santa Ana winds figure in the local imagination. The city burning is Los Angeles' deepest image of itself. The violence and unpredictability of the Santa Ana affect the entire quality of life in LA, accentuate its impermanence, its unreliability. The wind shows us how close to the edge we are." And so I was curious for you, before we kind of get deep on, forest management, how much of this you see as a part of the broader California story or something unique to Los Angeles and the Santa Ana.
So what the fire nerds call the WUI, the wildland urban interface, is like the most dangerous spot for people in California. And LA, even though it's a huge city, sort of falls into that category. So there's a lot to burn right near the city. And the Santa Ana winds, a colleague of mine was sending me images of the Santa Ana's blowing the shingles off her house and like calling it Didion weather. So like if you're a reader, you think of Didion when you think of the Santa Ana winds, and wind is like the huge unspoken part of fire stories. Like, these big fires generally don't start like on the ground from one house to another. They start with embers getting blown in the wind. And so right now in LA, there are these huge windstorms that can carry embers. I don't know how far they're blowing in LA right now, but for like a mile, for like a really long time. And that becomes the impossibility of fighting them, is you don't know where some burning hunk of wood is going to land next and light that spot on fire. So the Santa Anas are a huge part of what's going on in LA right now. If there wasn't a windstorm, this fire would be really different.
In that 2020 ProPublica piece, you interviewed a guy named Tim Inglesby.
Yeah.
And he had started a group, Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology, back in 2005. And you read that he'd been lobbying Congress trying to educate anybody who will listen about misguided fire policy that is leading to the mega fires we're seeing today. And so when you wrote that in that context of 2020, obviously this right now, everything gets so political so quick, right? And everybody's like, well, it's just the climate, or you have Trump, it's like it's just the smelt fish in the water coming down from the north, and it's like, but with regards to what's happening in California, there was a very specific thing that you were writing about that people have been warning about for a long time. Talk about that.
So that was the first fire article I ever wrote. Basically, I just started at ProPublica. California was burning, and they were like, write us a fire story this week. And I started talking to people, and I was so struck by people like Tim Inglesby, who had been following this for years. And this whole world that was new to me was like so exasperating for him. It was like, the Truman Show of fire weather. So, one of the most surprising things to me about publishing that was that both sides of our political spectrum, it was like the one thing people could agree on was forest management. Which is like the dorkiest thing to talk about in the world. But basically everybody could agree that we should be cutting down. We shouldn't be letting our forests get overgrown and turning into these huge timber piles. And so this is a message that firefighters and wildland firefighters have been talking about forever, of just California is a Mediterranean climate. Our landscape was meant to burn, and it is going to burn whether we want it to or not. So we can do that in a controlled way. We can go into the wildland urban interface and other areas and try to take the fuel out of there before the fire gets to it, or we can do nothing and then have these huge mega fires. So a few years ago, there was a big fire coming towards South Lake Tahoe. And South Lake Tahoe had actually done a really good job of forest management, and whatever other things happened too. But that was part of the reason that Tahoe didn't burn.
So here's the thing, though. If you say it was the one thing that the bipartisan everybody can agree on, and we're doing this wrong, but then it doesn't happen. I with a few exceptions. And you wrote, I think it was in the Times article, about in 2021, California was starting to do this. There was a managed fire that was created to clear out some of the brush, but then it got out of control, and there was damage, and then they'd stop doing it for the rest of the year, right? Because there was blowback from the community. That you had in the prehistoric California, 4.4 million acres burned each year. Between 82 and 98, California land managers burned about 30,000 acres a year. Between 99 and 2017, it dropped to 13,000 acres. So if people on both sides agree with it, why isn't it happening? What's happening?
Okay, theoretically, I should qualify this. Yeah. So when that mega fire piece came out, it was Ben Shapiro was retweeting it and Bernie Sanders.
Gosh.
It was everybody could say they were for it. But you're totally right. On a local level, when it comes to, are we going to have this intentional fire, managed fire, what people call it, in our county, people are very, very nervous, and understandably so. You have this fire burning, and then the winds come up, and usually it goes well, but occasionally the fire jumps and houses burn down, and then people are furious and feel why didn't we just put this whole damn thing out? And when you have that repeated again and again and again, you get in the situation like you were just reading those numbers about, where we're not burning nearly enough. And so when the fire weather comes, when the winds are blowing, when it hasn't rained, when all of these climate change impacts are happening, and all of these fires are made worse by climate change, if we haven't been able to manage it. And so yes, politically, theoretically, everybody's for it. At a local level, people are very upset.
Yeah. Another thing that jumped out at me from one of your stories was California only manages 3% of these lands. About half of it is a federal land management problem. If Inglesby and such have been advocating about this since 2005, we've had presidents and Department of Interiors of both parties, going back and forth over this. What do you have any sense for where is the failure point? at federal, California, both? Like, what's your sense for that?
I mean, it's a huge funding problem. Like it's being reported, sometimes misreported this week out of Los Angeles. Like firefighting's incredibly expensive. So there are several firefighting agencies in California. So there's the Forest Service, and then there's also CAL FIRE. So it's basically the federal firefighters and the state firefighters, and then there are county firefighters too. And so there's not enough money. There's often not enough personnel. A lot of those personnel are California inmates, which is a whole other issue that we could get into or not get into. So it's an economic mess, and there are times when the federal firefighting policy and the CAL FIRE policy are not in line, and so there's just like a political mess of what exactly to do and who's the boss.
Because it's January, some of the resources they put into this are seasonal, right? And so like they didn't have the people, the equipment, ready that they might have had it been, September.
Yes. So the seasonal firefighting workforce, there's a whole host of issues there of people who don't want to just be like seasonal contract employees anyway. But yes, so the seasonal workforce is down. Also, firefighting resources are often shared with Canada and Australia, like the big planes that come and like scoop water out of the ocean and dump them on the fire. So right now it's summer in Australia. They don't have planes to send us. They need to be fighting their own fires. But usually it has worked in the past for like, it's winter here, we can send our resources there, and it's, and vice versa. So part of what's happening too is due to the fact that it's January, those resources aren't available either.
The extent of it, just the fact that I anecdotally know 2 people whose houses have burned down, like just sort of shows like the extent of this. And it's just so widespread. And yet you have to talk about how this is like this challenge is also like a challenge of choice. Look, I live in New Orleans, so I'm making a similar choice, right? Like of people that are choosing to live in high risk areas, and that we're not kind of living in reality. You did this good interview with somebody who's talking about just like how, our brains are wired to be like, oh, everything is going to be fine, or it's the apocalypse, right? And there's not this in between of understanding managed risks and making choices that are smart and making growth choices that are smart. Anyway, you've done a lot of reporting on this in California. Like what, maybe this might be a moment for that to change. I don't know.
Maybe. Human beings are not rational. ProPublica's main climate reporter lives in a really fire-prone area and loves it. Like, it's just where his home is. So, like, people make these choices for lots of reasons, not just their climate risk. And frankly, insurance is a big part of that. Like, if whole complicated other story of are we really paying what the risk is in insurance? So, from talking to people, it seems to be the consensus that it's often very hard to make the decision that I should relocate right after your house is burned down, when you just want to get back home, when you just want to get back into your house again, and where whole counties are in distress, and it's not really a great moment to have to make a whole new plan. So one of the smartest people in fire had said to me, it's really his belief that the communities need to have planned ahead. That if you live in a fire-prone county or city, it would be really prudent to have a plan of what you're going to do and what your citizens are going to do if there's a huge fire. And are people going to rebuild their houses exactly where their footprints were in exactly the same fire-prone way? Or are you going to try to rebuild in a far more fire-safe kind of configuration of your city or your county? Or are people going to have plans to move? And that, like, it's just so emotional. Like you're saying, you live in New Orleans. I'm sure you live there because you like it. And you love people there.
Like, the house is on cinder blocks. We do different things with the windows. So
it's sort of the same thing, the idea of managed retreat from sea level rise. And people don't use the term as often, but it's the same situation of like, are people going to like retreat from these incredibly fire prone areas? Like my parents and my aunt all had houses in the same little cul-de-sac in Napa. And where in 2017, like My aunt's house burned to the ground. My parents' house a few doors away did not, but just by luck. The whole community rebuilt right there because that's what the insurance money was. Whatever. There's so much inertia in that moment. And it's also completely insane to rebuild in some of these places.
This podcast is sponsored by DeleteMe. DeleteMe makes it easy, quick, and safe to remove your personal data online at a time when surveillance and data breaches are common enough to make everyone vulnerable. This incoming administration has threatened to go after a lot of folks. I have been talking to some people that are on the Kash Patel enemies list, for example. One of the things that they are thinking about and they're recommending to me and others is just ensuring that you got your house in order when it comes to what is happening online. And that is a smart idea for anybody, even if you're not in Kash Patel's book. There are data breaches happening all the time. You can't see when the next one's going to come, and you don't know what information about you might be repackaged, shared, or leaked. So you have to be vigilant. DeleteMe is the best way to keep your personal information secure and out of the hands of data brokers. Data brokers make a profit off your data. Your data is a commodity, and anyone on the web can buy it and see your private details. This can lead to identity theft, phishing attempts, harassment, unwanted spam calls, and more. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for DeleteMe now at a special discount for our listeners. Get 20% off your DeleteMe plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/bulwark and use promo code BULWARK at checkout. The only way to get 20% off is to go to joindeleteme.com/bulwark and enter code BULWARK at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/bulwark, code BULWARK. Hey, y'all, if you love this podcast and want to listen to all Bulwark podcasts ad-free, join Bulwark Plus today. You can click the link in this description. You'll get the best politics newsletters in the business, and you can become a Bulwark Plus member right now. We'd appreciate it. What about the water side of this? I mean, this is a lot of the Republicans have really kind of glommed on to this particular, that there's what was water coming from the northern part of California, and it was slowed because of the fish, or there's certain environmental concerns. Like, how do you see kind of like that, the water management question in California intersecting with the firefighting question?
I haven't paid super close attention to what's going on now, but the big story of water in California is agriculture, not salmon. Like, it's really not. So to me, it's like, if you're not talking about agriculture when you're talking about water in California, you're having a completely disingenuous conversation. So I don't know exactly what's going on with these wells that had sort of dried up uphill and downhill. I think it was in Altadena. I think that's a much more local issue, but on a big scale of like, is this, people getting precious about salmon? That's a political conversation, not a practical one.
And if this is a moment to get people to listen, obviously the managed care of the forests and like the density of the forests, which are unnatural based on California's historic geology. And are there other things that the experts that you spoke to are saying, like, it's just insane that we're not doing this, or it's insane that we're doing this?
There are things like a certain subset of experts really talk about that are practical, that you can do for your own home, like have what people call a defensible space around your home. Like, don't have a lot of vegetation right up against your building, like clear your yard, have a roof that is far more fire safe than the roof that's probably on your house right now. So there's like a lot of talk about, ways that you can just get your house not to light your neighbor's house on fire. Like, a lot of the fire people also talk about that it's a little bit of a herd immunity problem, that once a community starts burning, all the houses are far more vulnerable. So if you have a house that's just like a tinderbox, you're putting your neighbor at risk. So there's that sort of very local level of protection. And then I think that there are just the big issues. Like, this is a climate change problem, or it's exacerbated by climate change. It is going to get worse. We have some control over how much worse it's going to get. And that's that conversation, and even just the idea of climate change so often gets left out of reporting when you're in a moment. There's like a huge house, like some celebrity's house is on fire, and that's like far more compelling than emissions. But if we're going to have a saner future, that needs to be part of the conversation.
Well, it absolutely needs to be part of the conversation. I have deep concerns about that. I do think we've just made a choice that at least in this country, we're not going to care about that for the next 4 years. And so that's why some of these other like management issues are so important, right? It's like, yes, we should do things to address climate. Also, too, like this is inevitably getting worse, and we can't like put our heads in the sand about that, you know?
We can't put our heads in the sand, and it's an issue that exists on like the biggest scale and the smallest scale. Like you're saying, like we're in a moment where politically it's really difficult to do anything about what was already a monstrously difficult problem, but you can still decide where you live. You can still decide what kind of roof you have. You can still, you can still make these very civic choices, which we do have a lot of control over.
Well, you wrote a beautiful article called "This Is Not the California I Married," just about your relationship to the state and these fires in New York Times Magazine. We'll put it in the show notes. It resonated with me on a deep level as somebody who's made a marriage of choice to a city with a different ecological environmental challenge. If you don't mind, you also wrote a profile of Sam Altman. Can I just pick your brain on that really quick before we leave? There's this big drama. People have missed it. Right now about Sam Altman, who runs OpenAI and is, I guess, probably the leading AI entrepreneur in the world right now for folks who aren't familiar with that. And his sister has gone through a lot of trauma, a lot of emotional issues, a lot of personal issues. And now there's a big lawsuit where she is firing some pretty serious allegations against her brother. But you had written a profile on Sam and went and interviewed Annie for it, which is like pretty interesting given the moments. I kind of just wanted to put a quarter in the machine and hear what you had to say about that, that whole story.
Well, yes. So this is true. I was writing a profile of Sam Altman, and I was just sort of doing regular reporter due diligence of trying to learn about his family. And I was reading an obituary for his father. And it mentions a sister, Annie Altman. Like the Altman brothers, he has two brothers, Jack and Max, are mentioned in the press all the time. And they're like, they had a venture fund. And, there are these pictures of them and narratives about them. And Annie was mentioned nowhere in any of this. Like the New Yorker ran a huge profile years ago, no mention of Annie. So I was like really struck of like, who is Annie? Why have I never heard about Annie? So I started poking around. And yes, I went to go visit her in Hawaii a year and a half ago. And like a lot of families, there's a really complicated dynamic in their family. And Annie, like, I don't know exactly what happened, like in private between the Altman siblings or what happened in private in their childhood, but she is obviously incredibly hurt by whatever it is that happened. And she has obviously been, until very recently, written out of the story for some reason. So I got pretty.
And it's wild. I get the wild part of the story that I read was like, I mean, she was like hungry. I mean, like she didn't have enough money for rent and for groceries. And Sam Altman is going to be one of the richest people in the world. Depending on the success of OpenAI, might be the richest man in the world. In the next decade. That's insane.
That's insane. So the part that is like was not difficult to report out at all are these kinds of facts that you're talking about, where Annie was living in her car while Sam was running OpenAI. Annie did not have money for food while Sam was running OpenAI. Annie started doing sex work because she needed money while Sam was running OpenAI. Annie got sent a memorial diamond. I don't know if you know about these things, out of their father's ashes. Like if somebody you love dies, you can send their ashes somewhere and have it turned into a diamond, like an actual diamond. So Annie is living in Hawaii, totally broke, worrying about money for food. When Sam sent her, I forget if it was an email or text, but I read these things saying like, where should I send this memorial diamond? And
it's like, bro, I'm living in my car.
Exactly.
What are you talking
like,
about?
will you send me $300 for food instead of this, like, what in her mind was like a totally perverse object of this parent that she loved and who did not want to be a diamond? So I can't speak to, facts I don't actually know about,
Sure.
but I can speak to the fact that there's been this very difficult, incredibly lopsided, not particularly compassionate seeming dynamic within the family that obviously just exploded this week into a lawsuit.
Yeah, look, I understand family dynamics are complicated. Sometimes you don't want to enable somebody that's, and try to encourage them to make good decisions or whatever. But like, if you're one of the richest people in the world and your sister can't afford groceries, you can't figure out a system for ensuring that they have groceries.
Yes.
That's
exactly. It's
stuff.
a worry. To me, I wound up being most interested in the fact that, like, we are all across from Sam Altman's power. We are all living in a world where he has a lot more power than almost all of us do. And his dynamic with Annie is some microcosm of that in some way. Yeah. So what is it?
Certainly raises some questions about how he's going to wield that power.
Of just like how good is he at dealing with vulnerable people while he has a lot more power than they do. And so part of reporting out on her and why I felt she was really important for whatever, there are lots of reasons, but that is one of them, of just like, what can we learn about a dynamic between Sam Altman and the vulnerable by looking at how he's handled this relationship with his sister.
It was quite an interesting piece. I encourage people to read it. I was reading it last night later because, I was looking at the other articles you've written and I was like, I should read this one. It's like, midnight and I'm scrolling through it. I was like, what? 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 I don't know why I hadn't read it when it came out. So I encourage you all to go check her Sam Altman profile. Also, megafires. Why won't anyone listen? This is not the California I married. It's a tragedy out there. It is awful. And my heart goes out to anybody who is involved with it or whose family's lost a home. And we'll, in the coming days, we'll be including in the show notes some kind of vetted places where you can support victims. So I appreciate that. Appreciate you, Liz Weil, for taking the time here to come on the pod. And everybody else, will see you back here tomorrow.